Ezra Whitehorse's weathered hands trembled as he set down the telegram, the paper fluttering to the kitchen table like a dying leaf. The $75 he'd paid for that girl at the labor auction had seemed like charity then. Now it felt like the price of his soul. The words weren't a ransom note. They were a death warrant. Mary's coffee cup shattered against the wooden floor, the dark liquid spreading like spilled blood as she read over his shoulder. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic tick of their grandfather clock, counting down to something neither could name. He remembered Sarah Ironcloud's eyes that first day, not the grateful tears he'd expected from a rescued child, but the calculating stare of someone who'd already seen too much. The way she'd studied their home like she was memorizing escape routes, not settling in. "Get the rifle," Ezra whispered, his voice barely audible above the prairie wind rattling their windows. What had they brought into their home, and how many more would die before the truth came to light? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The Wyoming Territory stretched endlessly beyond their ranch house windows, a harsh expanse of prairie grass and broken dreams that had claimed more souls than it had ever blessed. Spring of 1885 had been merciless to the cattle, and the mortgage papers stacked on Ezra's desk told a story of dwindling hope that no amount of hard work seemed able to rewrite. Ezra Whitehorse had built this ranch with his own bloodied hands 16 years ago, when he'd returned from the war carrying more ghosts than medals. At 42, his face bore the weathered lines of a man who'd seen too much death and dealt too much of it himself. The nightmare of Antietam still visited him on stormy nights, when the thunder sounded too much like cannon fire and the rain against the windows reminded him of blood on southern soil. Mary Whitehorse moved through their home like a woman under water, her movements careful and deliberate, as if sudden gestures might shatter what little remained of her composure. At 38, she should have been surrounded by the laughter of children. But 16 years of marriage had brought nothing but monthly disappointments and the pitying glances of neighbors who whispered about God's will and barren women. The empty bedroom upstairs remained a shrine to possibilities that grew dimmer with each passing season. Their ranch sat on 2,000 acres of stubborn land that fought every attempt at prosperity. The cattle prices had plummeted after the harsh winter, and the railroad companies were circling like vultures, offering pennies on the dollar for property that represented everything Ezra had left of his father's legacy. The banknotes were coming due, and honest work no longer seemed sufficient to keep the wolves from their door. Mary spent her days tending a garden that bloomed beautifully but fed only 2 mouths, cooking elaborate meals that left too many leftovers, and mending clothes that would outlast their marriage if children never came to wear them out. She'd stopped attending the church socials where other women discussed their children's accomplishments, and Ezra had stopped asking why. The neighbors had grown distant over the years, their initial sympathy replaced by the uncomfortable silence that surrounds failure. In a territory where a man's worth was measured by his ability to provide and procreate, Ezra felt himself diminishing with each childless year. The ranch hands whispered that maybe the Lord was punishing him for the things he'd done in the war, and sometimes, in his darkest moments, Ezra wondered if they might be right. Their marriage had become a careful dance around the subject that consumed them both. Mary would set the table for 4 out of habit, then quietly remove the extra plates. Ezra would mention expanding the house someday, then fall silent when he realized there was no someday worth planning for. They loved each other desperately, but love couldn't fill the silence that echoed through rooms that should have been chaotic with young voices. The morning everything changed started like any other, with coffee too strong and dreams too fragile to survive another day of reality. The cattle auction in Cheyenne drew desperate people like moths to a dying flame, and Ezra Whitehorse had never felt more desperate in his life. The spring morning air carried the stench of unwashed bodies, tobacco spit, and the peculiar desperation that clung to men who'd run out of better options. He'd come to sell 3 head of cattle that represented his last hope of making the mortgage payment, but the prices being called out made his stomach clench with dread. Lot 47, prime heifer, 3 years old, good breeding stock, the auctioneer's voice cut through the crowd's murmur. The bidding started at $12 and died at $8. Ezra watched his future crumble with each failed lot, his weathered hands gripping his hat until his knuckles turned white. But it was the other auction that caught his attention, the one that made decent men look away and merchants count their coins. In the corner of the livestock yard, a smaller crowd had gathered around a makeshift platform where a different kind of commerce was taking place. Children, mostly, some barely past their 10th birthday, standing with the hollow-eyed resignation of livestock waiting for slaughter. Next lot, young woman, age 15, strong back, good with animals and household work. The man calling the auction had the smooth voice of someone who'd learned to make evil sound reasonable. Bidding starts at $50. Ezra found himself moving closer, drawn by something he couldn't name. The girl on the platform stood perfectly still, but her eyes moved constantly, cataloging faces, exits, possibilities. She was thin in the way that spoke of too many missed meals, her brown hair hanging in tangles around a face that might have been pretty if not for the careful blankness of her expression. Sarah Ironcloud, the auctioneer called her, though Ezra suspected that name had been assigned rather than chosen. She wore a dress that had been mended so many times the original fabric was barely visible beneath the patches, and shoes that had holes worn through the leather. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold, dark, intelligent, and filled with something that looked uncomfortably like pity. $60, called a man near the front, and Ezra recognized him as Thomas Brewster, who owned a small farm north of town. Brewster was known for working his help near to death, and the stories about what happened to the young women in his employ had never been proven but were whispered about in every saloon from here to Denver. 70, came another voice, this one belonging to a stranger with soft hands and expensive clothes who'd been examining the girl like she was a prize mare. Ezra felt something hot and sick rise in his throat. He thought of Mary at home, sitting in their too quiet kitchen, darning socks that would never be outgrown by children's feet. He thought of the empty bedroom upstairs and the cradle he'd carved 15 years ago that still sat in their barn, gathering dust and broken promises. 75. He heard himself say, his voice carrying across the crowd with surprising strength. The bidding stopped. $75 was more than most of these children would earn in 2 years of labor, more than many families saw in a season of good crops. The auctioneer's eyes lit up with the particular greed of a man who'd stumbled onto unexpected profit. 75 from the gentleman in back. Do I hear 80? The silence stretched like a held breath. Even Brewster, whose cruelty was legendary, wasn't fool enough to bid against Ezra Whitehorse when he'd set his mind to something. The expensive stranger shook his head and melted back into the crowd, apparently unwilling to pay premium prices for his particular appetites. Sold to Mr. Whitehorse for $75. As Ezra made his way forward to complete the transaction, he caught sight of a familiar figure at the edge of the crowd. Judge Cornelius Blackthorne stood watching from beneath the brim of his black hat, his pale eyes fixed on the girl with an intensity that made Ezra's skin crawl. The judge was a powerful man in these parts, his influence extending far beyond the courthouse into every aspect of territorial politics and commerce. When their eyes met across the crowd, Blackthorne's thin lips curved in something that might have been a smile but felt more like a threat. "You've bought yourself quite a prize there, Whitehorse," Blackthorne said as Ezra approached the platform. "That one's got more fire in her than most. Hope you can handle her." There was something in the judge's tone that made Ezra's hand drift instinctively toward the Colt at his hip, a gesture that wasn't lost on either man. "I reckon I can manage just fine, Judge." Sarah Ironcloud watched this exchange with those calculating eyes, and Ezra could swear he saw her memorize every word, every gesture, every threat that passed between the two men. The summer of 1885 settled over the White Horse Ranch like a heavy blanket, bringing with it changes that nobody could have predicted. Sarah Ironcloud had been with them for 6 weeks, and in that time she'd transformed from the hollow-eyed girl on the auction platform into something that made Ezra increasingly uneasy. Not because she was trouble, quite the opposite. She was too perfect, too quick to learn, too eager to please in ways that felt calculated rather than genuine. Mary had taken to the girl like a drowning woman grabbing a lifeline. She'd moved Sarah into the spare bedroom upstairs, the one that had been intended for the children who never came, and filled it with second-hand furniture and carefully mended dresses. Every morning she'd brush Sarah's hair with the silver brush that had been her mother's, humming lullabies she'd never had occasion to sing. For the first time in 16 years, Mary Whitehorse smiled more than she wept. But Sarah's transformation went beyond the expected adjustment of a rescued child. Within a week, she was managing the household accounts with a mathematical precision that surprised even Ezra. She knew exactly how much feed the cattle required, could predict weather patterns from cloud formations, and demonstrated a knowledge of ranch operations that seemed impossible for someone who'd supposedly spent her life in labor camps and city streets. The first sign of real trouble came on a scorching Tuesday morning when Ezra spotted dust clouds on the eastern horizon. A small convoy of men on horseback approached the ranch, their movements too deliberate to be casual visitors. Leading them was a thin man in a railroad company uniform, flanked by 2 others who carried themselves like hired guns rather than surveyors. "Mr. Whitehorse," the railroad man called out as they reined in near the house. "Name's Patterson, Union Pacific Railroad. We're here about your property." Ezra stepped onto the porch, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "What about it?" Patterson dismounted and pulled a rolled document from his saddlebag. "Seems there's been some confusion about the boundaries of your claim. According to our survey, this land was never properly filed with the territorial government. Makes it available for railroad development." The words hit Ezra like a physical blow. He'd filed those papers himself 16 years ago, had the receipts and documentation locked in his safe. But in the territories, paperwork had a way of disappearing when powerful interests were involved. "That's a lie," Ezra said, his voice steady despite the rage building in his chest. Now, Mr. Whitehorse, no need for harsh words. The railroad's prepared to offer fair compensation for any improvements you've made. Say $500 for the buildings and fencing, $500 for a ranch worth 20 times that amount." Ezra felt his vision blur with anger, but before he could respond, Sarah appeared at his elbow. She moved with the fluid grace of someone trained not to be noticed, and somehow she'd gotten close enough to read the documents in Patterson's hands. "Those survey markers you're referencing," Sarah said, her voice carrying a confidence that seemed to surprise even her. "They're based on the 1879 territorial survey, aren't they?" Patterson's eyes narrowed. What would a child know about territorial surveys? Enough to know that the 1879 survey was invalidated by congressional action in 1883 due to measurement errors. Any land claims based on those markers are void. Sarah's voice remained steady, but Ezra noticed her hands trembling slightly. "I believe you'll find Mr. Whitehorse's original filing predates your company's claims by several years." The silence that followed was deafening. Patterson's face had gone pale, and one of his companions had moved his hand closer to his gun. These weren't men accustomed to being challenged, especially not by a 15-year-old girl who should have known nothing about territorial law. "You've got quite the little lawyer here, Whitehorse," Patterson said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Might want to be careful about who you're taking advice from. Sometimes people aren't what they seem." After the railroad men had ridden away, Ezra found himself studying Sarah with new eyes. She'd returned to her quiet, helpful demeanor, but questions burned in his mind like acid. How did a girl from the labor camps know territorial law? Where had she learned to read legal documents with such precision? And why did she seem to know exactly what arguments would send powerful men retreating? That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Ezra decided to test his suspicions. "Sarah," he said casually, "where exactly did you live before the auction?" "Different places," she replied, her voice carefully neutral. "Wherever there was work. Must have been hard, moving around so much." "You learned to adapt." "Learn a lot of things, I'd imagine, like reading legal documents." For just a moment, Sarah's careful mask slipped, and Ezra caught a glimpse of something calculating in her eyes. Then it was gone, replaced by the grateful innocence she wore like armor. "I picked up things here and there. People talk, and I listened." It was a reasonable explanation, but it didn't account for the precision with which she dismantled Patterson's claims. Ezra had seen lawyers with less knowledge of territorial law than Sarah had displayed. 3 days later, a letter arrived that confirmed his worst fears. The handwriting was careful and feminine, but the words were those of someone who understood the dangerous game being played around them. "Mr. Whitehorse, you are in more danger than you know. The railroad is only the beginning. Trust no one, especially those closest to you. Someone is watching. Someone is planning. Someone is coming. A friend." That night, Ezra locked the letter in his safe and checked the loads in all his guns. Sarah Ironcloud might not be who she claimed to be, but the threats surrounding them were real enough. The only question was whether the girl sleeping under his roof was his salvation or his destruction. The late summer heat pressed down on the White Horse Ranch like a suffocating blanket. But inside their home, a different kind of warmth had begun to bloom. Mary moved through her daily routines with a lightness that Ezra hadn't seen in years, humming old hymns as she taught Sarah the intricate art of preserving peaches and the delicate balance required for perfect sourdough bread. The girl absorbed every lesson with an intensity that went beyond mere survival. She watched Mary's hands with the devotion of someone memorizing sacred rituals. "Now, the secret to a proper pie crust," Mary explained, her flour-dusted hands demonstrating the technique she'd learned from her own mother decades ago, "is knowing when to stop. Work it too much, and it'll be tough as leather. Too little, and it'll fall apart when you need it most." Sarah nodded solemnly, her own hands mimicking Mary's movements with surprising precision. "Like trust," she said quietly, so quietly that Mary almost missed it. "What's that, dear?" "Nothing, Mrs. Whitehorse, just thinking out loud." But Mary caught the shadow that passed across Sarah's face, the brief moment when her carefully constructed gratitude slipped to reveal something deeper and more complex underneath. These moments were becoming more frequent, glimpses of a girl who carried knowledge too heavy for 15-year-old shoulders. In the evenings, after the ranch work was done and the dishes were cleaned, Ezra had taken to teaching Sarah the business side of ranching. She sat at his desk in the study, her dark hair falling across her face as she bent over ledger books and territorial maps, absorbing information about cattle prices, seasonal migrations, and the complex web of relationships that kept a ranch profitable. "The key to survival out here," Ezra explained one evening as they reviewed the accounts by lamplight, "is diversification. Never put all your eggs in one basket. Cattle prices drop, you better have something else keeping food on the table." "Like the horses," Sarah said, not looking up from the columns of figures she was reviewing. "You could expand the breeding program. There's a market for good stock in Denver and beyond." Ezra paused, struck by the casual confidence in her voice. What makes you think that? The railroad's expanding, more settlers coming through. They'll need horses for farming, transportation, everything. She looked up at him then, her eyes bright with enthusiasm that seemed genuine. And with your reputation for honest dealing, you'd have an advantage over the bigger operations that cut corners. The analysis was sound. Better than sound, it was brilliant. But it raised the same questions that had been gnawing at Ezra for weeks. How did a girl from the labor camps understand market economics? Where had she learned to read the subtle indicators that even experienced ranchers missed? Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of hooves in the yard. Ezra moved to the window and saw a familiar figure dismounting from a black gelding. Judge Cornelius Blackthorne had come calling, and at this hour it wouldn't be for social purposes. "Sarah," Ezra said quietly, "go upstairs. Stay there until I call for you." But Sarah had already moved, not toward the stairs but to a position where she could observe without being seen. The girl had instincts that spoke of experience with dangerous situations, and those instincts were telling her that running might not be the safest option. Ezra opened the door before Blackthorne could knock, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "Judge, kind of late for a social call." "Indeed it is, Whitehorse." Blackthorne's pale eyes seemed to glow in the lamplight, and there was something predatory in his smile. "I'm here on official business." "There have been complaints about your domestic arrangements." "What kind of complaints?" "The kind that suggest you might not be providing proper guardianship for that girl you purchased. Some folks are saying she's been seen around town asking questions she shouldn't be asking, displaying knowledge that raises concerns." Ezra felt his blood turn to ice. "What kind of concerns?" "The kind that make people wonder if she's really the innocent victim you've been presenting to the community, the kind that make them question your judgment in bringing her into your home." Blackthorne stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The kind that suggests she might be working for people who don't have your best interests at heart." From her hiding place, Sarah felt her heart hammering against her ribs. She'd known this moment would come eventually, had been dreading and preparing for it in equal measure. The careful balance she'd been maintaining, the delicate dance between gratitude and deception, was beginning to crumble. "I don't know what you're getting at, Judge," Ezra said, his voice steady despite the tension radiating from every line of his body. "Don't you? Then let me be more direct. That girl has been seen corresponding with certain individuals with connections to organizations that operate outside the law. Now, I'm not saying you were aware of this when you took her in. You've always struck me as an honest man, if a naive one. But ignorance isn't always a defense." Mary appeared in the hallway, her face pale but determined. "Judge Blackthorne, I don't know what rumors you've been listening to, but Sarah is a good girl. She's been nothing but helpful and grateful since she came to us. Mrs. Whitehorse, I'm sure that's how it appears. These people are very good at creating the illusion of normalcy. Very good at making themselves seem like victims when they're actually predators." The word hung in the air like a curse. Sarah pressed herself further back into the shadows, her mind racing through possibilities and escape routes. She'd known that eventually her past would catch up with her, but she'd hoped to have more time. Time to figure out how to protect the people who'd shown her the first genuine kindness she'd ever known. "What exactly are you accusing her of?" Ezra demanded. "I'm not accusing anyone of anything yet. But I am suggesting that you might want to reconsider your living arrangements before the territorial authorities start asking harder questions. Questions about how a girl from the labor camps happens to know so much about territorial law, about railroad regulations, about the kinds of things that only come from very specific kinds of education." Blackthorne's words were like arrows finding their mark. Sarah had revealed too much, been too helpful, demonstrated knowledge that no legitimate refugee would possess. She'd let her desire to protect the Whitehorse family override her survival instincts, and now everyone was in danger. "And if I don't?" Ezra asked. "Then you might find yourself facing charges related to harboring fugitives, conspiracy, maybe even accessory to crimes that haven't been fully investigated yet. These are serious matters, Whitehorse. The kind that can destroy a man's reputation, his property, his freedom." The threat was clear, and everyone in the room understood the stakes. In the territories where law was often a matter of interpretation and justice was dispensed by whoever held the most power, Judge Blackthorn's word carried the weight of life and death. "I'll need some time to think about it," Ezra said finally. "Of course, but don't take too long. These situations have a way of escalating quickly once the wrong people start asking questions." Blackthorn tipped his hat to Mary, his gesture mocking in its politeness. "Mrs. Whitehorse, always a pleasure." After the judge had gone, the three of them sat in the kitchen in heavy silence. The coffee Mary had prepared had grown cold, and the cheerful domesticity that had characterized their evenings seemed like a distant memory. "Sarah," Ezra said finally, his voice gentler than she'd expected, "I think it's time you told us the truth." She looked up at him. This man who'd paid $75 to save her from a fate worse than death. This woman who'd treated her like the daughter she'd never had. The lies she'd been living felt suddenly unbearable, but the truth felt even more dangerous. "I don't know where to start," she whispered. "Start with who you really are," Mary said, reaching across the table to take Sarah's hands in her own. "Whatever it is, we'll face it together." And for the first time since arriving at the ranch, Sarah Ironcloud began to cry. Not the careful, grateful tears of a rescued victim, but the desperate, terrified sobs of a girl who'd been carrying secrets too heavy for anyone to bear alone. "My name isn't Sarah Ironcloud," she began, her voice breaking. "And I'm not the person you think I am." Outside, a storm was building on the horizon, and with it, a reckoning that would test everything the Whitehorse family thought they knew about love, loyalty, and the price of truth. The storm that had been threatening all evening finally broke just after midnight, unleashing torrents of rain that hammered against the ranch house windows like bullets. But the tempest outside was nothing compared to the one raging within the Whitehorse kitchen, where Sarah's confession had torn apart everything they thought they knew about their carefully constructed family. "My real name is Sarah Blackthorn," she said, her voice barely audible above the thunder. "Judge Blackthorn is my father." The words hit Ezra like a physical blow. He felt the blood drain from his face as the implications crashed over him in waves. Mary's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp of betrayal and disbelief. The girl they'd taken into their home, the child Mary had begun to love like her own daughter, was the offspring of their greatest enemy. "That's impossible," Mary whispered. "He would never have let you be sold at that auction." "He would never—" "He arranged it," Sarah interrupted, her tears flowing freely now. "Every bit of it. The auction, the bidding, even making sure you'd be there that day. It was all part of his plan." Ezra's hand moved instinctively to his gun, a gesture so automatic he didn't realize he'd made it until he saw Sarah flinch. The girl, this stranger who'd been living in their home, eating at their table, learning their secrets, pressed herself back against her chair as if expecting violence. "Ezra, no!" Mary said sharply, but her voice carried its own note of betrayal and fear. "What plan?" Ezra's voice was deadly quiet, the tone he'd used during the war when interrogating Confederate prisoners. "What exactly were you sent here to do?" Sarah's composure finally crumbled completely. The sophisticated knowledge, the careful gratitude, the perfect performance of rescued innocence, all of it stripped away to reveal a terrified 15-year-old girl who'd been carrying an impossible burden. "To watch you," she sobbed. "To learn your routines, your weaknesses, your finances. to find out everything about your operation so he could destroy you when the time was right." "Why?" Mary asked, though part of her already dreaded the answer. "Because of what happened during the war. Because of his son, his real son, Thomas." Sarah's voice broke on the name. "You killed him at Antietam, Mr. Whitehorse. Shot him during the battle when he was trying to surrender." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Ezra felt the familiar nightmare of that terrible day washing over him, the confusion of battle, the screaming wounded, the impossible choices that haunted him still. He remembered a young Confederate soldier, barely old enough to shave, raising his hands in surrender just as another rebel sniper's bullet had nearly taken Ezra's head off. In the chaos and terror of that moment, Ezra had fired without thinking, his war-trained reflexes overriding his humanity. "He wasn't surrendering," Ezra said quietly, his voice heavy with 16 years of guilt. "He had a gun trained on my sergeant. I saw the muzzle flash." "That's not how my father remembers it," Sarah replied. "He says you murdered a boy who was trying to give up. Says you shot him in cold blood because you enjoyed killing." "Your father wasn't there." "No, but he spent years tracking down witnesses, building a case in his mind. He convinced himself that you were a monster who needed to be punished." Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "When he became a territorial judge, he started planning his revenge. Real, slow, careful revenge that would take everything from you the way his son's death took everything from him." Mary stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the wooden floor. "So this has all been a lie. Every moment, every kindness, every—" Her voice broke. "Did any of it mean anything to you at all?" The pain in Mary's voice was like a knife through Sarah's heart. "It started as a lie," she admitted. "But it became real, more real than anything I've ever known. You showed me what a mother's love looks like, Mrs. Whitehorse. You taught me what it means to be part of a family." "Don't," Mary said harshly. "Don't you dare talk about family. You're not our daughter. You're a spy, a weapon he sent to destroy us from the inside." "I know how it looks, but—" "How it looks?" Ezra's voice had gone dangerously quiet. "You've been reporting back to him this whole time, haven't you? Every conversation, every vulnerable moment, every detail about our lives that he could use against us." Sarah's silence was answer enough. "Get out," Mary said suddenly, her voice cold as winter steel. "Pack your things and get out of my house right now." "Mrs. Whitehorse, please let me explain." "Explain what? How you've been laughing at us this whole time. How you've been playing the grateful little daughter while plotting our destruction?" Mary's composure finally shattered, years of accumulated pain and disappointment pouring out in a torrent of rage. "I actually thought God had finally answered my prayers. I thought he'd sent me the child I'd been begging for all these years." "He did," Sarah said desperately. "Don't you see? My father sent me here to spy on you, but God sent me here to be saved by you, to learn what real love looks like." "Real love?" Mary's laugh was bitter and broken. "Real love doesn't lie. Real love doesn't deceive. Real love doesn't come into your home pretending to be something it's not." The storm outside seemed to intensify, as if nature itself was responding to the emotional devastation taking place inside the small ranch house. Lightning illuminated the windows in stark, violent flashes, and the thunder that followed seemed to shake the very foundations of their world. "Please," Sarah begged, turning to Ezra. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but you have to believe me. I never wanted to hurt you, either of you. When I first came here, I thought you were the monster my father said you were. But you're not. You're the kindest man I've ever known." "Kind enough to be fooled by a child," Ezra replied, his voice heavy with self-recrimination. "Kind enough to bring a viper into my own home." "I'm not a viper. I'm just a girl who's been used by a man who can't let go of his grief." Sarah stood slowly, her movements careful and deliberate. "But I understand if you can't forgive me. I understand if you never want to see me again." She moved toward the stairs, each step seeming to echo like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. But as she reached the doorway, she turned back one last time. "For what it's worth," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "these past months have been the happiest of my life. I know that doesn't make up for the lies, but I wanted you to know." After Sarah had gone upstairs, Ezra and Mary sat in the kitchen listening to the storm rage outside and feeling the ruins of their dreams settling around them like dust. The girl they'd begun to love like a daughter was their enemy's weapon, trained and deployed against them with surgical precision. "What do we do now?" Mary asked eventually. "I don't know," Ezra admitted, "but we can't let her stay. Not after this. She's just a child, Ezra. Whatever her father has done, whatever he's trained her to do, she's still just a 15-year-old girl. A 15-year-old girl who's been feeding information to a man who wants to see us destroyed." Ezra rubbed his face with his hands, feeling every one of his 42 years. "We can't trust her, Mary. We can't risk it." Upstairs, Sarah sat on the bed in what had briefly been her room, staring out at the storm and trying to figure out what came next. She could run. Had always been good at disappearing when situations became untenable. But the thought of leaving the first real home she'd ever known felt like tearing out her own heart. She pulled out a small piece of paper and began to write, her hand shaking with emotion and exhaustion. If she was going to leave, there were things the Whitehorse family needed to know. Dangerous things that her father had planned, things that would happen whether she was there to witness them or not. The letter would be her final gift to the people who'd shown her what love looked like, even if that love had been built on lies that were now crashing down around all of them like the thunder outside their windows. Dawn broke gray and merciless over the Whitehorse Ranch, bringing with it a clarity that felt more like punishment than revelation. Sarah had vanished sometime during the night, leaving behind only an empty room and a letter that would haunt Ezra and Mary for the rest of their lives. The storm had passed, but the devastation it left behind was nothing compared to the wreckage of their hearts. Mary discovered the letter first, folded neatly on the kitchen table beside a cup of coffee that had grown cold hours ago. Her hands trembled as she read the carefully written words, each line revealing new horrors that made their personal betrayal seem almost insignificant by comparison. "Ezra," she called, her voice hollow with shock. "You need to read this." He found her standing by the window, the letter clutched in her white-knuckled grip, tears streaming down her face. The woman who had raged against Sarah's deception just hours before now looked as if she'd been struck by lightning. The letter was written in Sarah's careful script, but the words themselves belonged to someone much older and more frightened than the girl they'd thought they knew. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Whitehorse, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. I know you can never forgive me for lying to you, and I don't expect you to. But before I disappear from your lives forever, there are things you need to know. Dangerous things that will happen whether I'm here or not. My father's plan was never just about revenge for his son's death. That was only the beginning. He's been systematically destroying every family in this territory that he believes wronged him during the war. The Hendersons' barn fire last spring wasn't an accident. The Millers' cattle dying of poison wasn't bad luck. The bank foreclosing on the Pratt's farm wasn't just business. He's been working with the railroad company and certain territorial officials to drive honest families off their land. The children at those labor auctions, most of them aren't orphans or runaways. They're stolen from families that won't sell their property. My father provides legal cover for the kidnappings, and the railroad provides the muscle. Your ranch sits on one of the richest gold veins in Wyoming territory. They've known about it for months, waiting for the right moment to take it from you. The mortgage troubles, the cattle prices dropping, none of it's natural. They've been manipulating the markets, bribing officials, doing whatever it takes to force you into bankruptcy. Mrs. Whitehorse, your inability to have children isn't God's will or natural misfortune. 16 years ago, my father poisoned your well water with mercury compounds. He wanted to make sure you could never give Mr. Whitehorse the family that would make him truly happy. It was part of his long revenge, taking away not just your husband's life, but his future. I know this because I found his journals hidden in his study. Years of planning, years of patient destruction aimed at families across the territory. I've been copying the evidence for months, building a case that could expose everything. But I'm just one girl, and he's a territorial judge with powerful friends. There are 7 other children like me, children he's trained and placed with specific families to gather information and prepare for destruction. Most of them don't know the full scope of what they're part of. They think they're just earning their keep by reporting back about their adoptive family's activities. The attack on your ranch will come within the week. Not from the railroad men directly, but from Indian raiders that my father has hired to make it look like a natural frontier tragedy. They plan to kill you both and burn the house, making it appear that you died defending your property from savage attacks. I was supposed to be found among the victims, a tragic casualty that would generate sympathy for my poor grieving father. I can't let that happen. I won't let the first people who ever showed me real love die because of my father's twisted need for revenge. But I also can't stay and put you in more danger. My presence here endangers everyone I've come to care about. I've hidden copies of my father's journals in the old oak tree by the creek, wrapped in oilcloth and buried 2 feet down at the base of the trunk. The evidence is all there. Names, dates, payments, correspondence with railroad officials, and corrupt territorial administrators. It's enough to bring down his entire network, but only if it reaches honest authorities outside his influence. Mrs. Whitehorse, the kindness you showed me these past months wasn't wasted on a deceiver. You taught me what maternal love looks like, and for the first time in my life I understood why people fight so hard to protect their families. Mr. Whitehorse, your patience and wisdom showed me what a real father should be. Not a man who uses children as weapons, but one who guides them toward becoming better than they ever thought possible. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I hope someday you might understand that every moment of love I showed you was real. The lies were about my past and my purpose, but my feelings for you both were the truest thing I've ever experienced. Please leave the ranch immediately. Take the evidence and get to Denver, where there are federal marshals who might listen. Don't try to fight this on your own. My father has too much power, too many allies. Your only chance is to expose the entire conspiracy at once. I'll find a way to warn the other families if I can, but I don't know if there's enough time. Just remember that not all of us children are willing participants in our parents' sins. Some of us are just trying to survive in a world that sees us as tools rather than people. Thank you for giving me a glimpse of what family should be. Even if it was built on lies, the love was real. Sarah. Mary sank into a chair, the letter falling from her nerveless fingers. The revelation about her infertility hit her like a physical blow. 16 years of self-blame and secret shame. 16 years of wondering what sin she'd committed to deserve such punishment. And it had all been deliberate, calculated. The work of a madman who thought her husband needed to suffer for a split-second decision made in the chaos of war. "We have to get that evidence," Ezra said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "We have to stop this before more families are destroyed." "But Sarah's made her choice. She's trying to save us, Mary." "The least we can do is make sure her sacrifice means something." As they prepared to flee their home, Mary found herself thinking not of the girl who had deceived them, but of the child who had sat at their kitchen table learning to make pie crust, who had hummed while hanging laundry on the line, who had brought laughter back into their too-quiet house. That girl had been real, even if her origins were false. The tragedy wasn't just that they were losing their home and their safety. It was that they were losing the daughter they'd never known they'd found. The ride to Denver took 3 grueling days across terrain that seemed determined to break both horse and rider. Ezra and Mary pushed their mounts to the limit, stopping only when absolutely necessary, driven by the terrible knowledge that every hour they delayed might mean another family destroyed by Judge Blackthorn's methodical revenge. The evidence from Sarah's letter burned in Ezra's saddlebags like a coal of accusation, each page documenting years of systematic corruption that reached deep into the territorial government. Federal Marshal William Crawford was a man who'd seen enough frontier justice to recognize the real thing when it walked into his office. He listened to their story with the patient attention of someone accustomed to separating truth from desperate fiction, his weathered hands turning over the documents they'd retrieved from beneath the oak tree. The journals were damning, page after page of meticulous planning, payments to corrupt officials, and cold-blooded calculations about which families needed to be eliminated for the larger scheme to succeed. "This is extensive," Crawford said finally, setting down the last journal. "Blackthorn's been building this network for over a decade. Railroad companies, territorial judges, even some federal appointees. If this is accurate, we're looking at one of the largest land fraud conspiracies in territorial history." "It's accurate," Mary said, her voice hollow with exhaustion and grief. "That girl, Sarah, she documented everything. Names, dates, amounts. She even copied correspondence between Blackthorn and his co-conspirators." Crawford studied the evidence again, his expression growing grimmer with each page. "According to this, there are at least 15 other families currently being targeted. The Hendersons, the Pratts, the McCormicks, all people I know personally. Good families who've never done anything worse than own land that somebody else wants." "Can you stop it?" Ezra asked. "I can try. But Blackthorn has powerful friends, and some of the people named in these documents have considerable influence in Washington. This kind of investigation takes time, and from what you're telling me, time is something these families don't have." The marshal's words confirmed Ezra's worst fears. Even with irrefutable evidence of the conspiracy, the wheels of federal justice moved slowly, while Blackthorn's private justice moved with deadly efficiency. Somewhere in the Wyoming Territory, families were going about their daily routines, completely unaware that they'd been marked for destruction by a madman's methodical revenge. "There's something else," Crawford continued, pulling out a telegram that had been waiting on his desk. "Word came in this morning about a ranch attack near Laramie. The Patterson family killed in what appeared to be an Indian raid, house burned, cattle scattered. But the local sheriff found something interesting in the ashes." He handed them the telegram, and Ezra felt his blood turn to ice as he read the details. The attackers had been too careful, too organized for a typical raid. They'd left behind evidence that pointed to white men disguised as Indians, and one of the raiders had been wounded badly enough to leave a substantial blood trail leading away from the scene. Following that blood trail led us to a man named Jake Morrison, known associate of various criminal enterprises. Before he died from his wounds, he confessed to being part of a larger operation, said a territorial judge was paying good money for families to disappear under circumstances that wouldn't raise federal interest. Mary grabbed Ezra's arm, her fingers digging into his flesh. "The Pattersons had 3 children," she whispered. "Little ones. All dead," Crawford confirmed grimly, "along with their parents." Morrison said the children were considered loose ends that needed to be tied up. The casual brutality of it struck them both like physical blows. This wasn't just about land or revenge. It was about a systematic elimination of anyone who stood in the way of Blackthorn's twisted vision of justice. Children murdered not because they posed any threat, but simply because their continued existence was inconvenient to the larger plan. "We're organizing a federal task force," Crawford continued. "Multiple jurisdictions, coordinated raids, everything necessary to take down this entire network. But it'll take weeks to organize properly. And based on this intelligence, Blackthorn's timeline has accelerated. He knows his operation is exposed. That girl's disappearance would have warned him that his plans were compromised." "Then we have to go back," Ezra said. "We have to warn the other families ourselves." "That's suicide, and you know it. Blackthorn has dozens of men at his disposal, and now he knows you're working against him. You show up in Wyoming territory, you'll be dead before you can warn anyone." But even as Crawford spoke, they all knew that warning the families was exactly what had to be done. The federal investigation might eventually bring Blackthorn to justice, but justice for the dead was small comfort to those who might still be saved. "There's another problem," Crawford said, his voice heavy with reluctance. "According to these documents, Judge Blackthorn has been using children as intelligence assets for years. Most of them probably don't understand the full scope of what they're involved in, but they've been reporting back to him about their adoptive families. When this operation collapses, those children will be in extreme danger. Blackthorn won't leave witnesses alive who can testify about his methods." The implications hit Mary like a hammer blow. Sarah wasn't the only child caught in Blackthorn's web. There were others, innocents who'd been manipulated and used just as she had been. When the conspiracy unraveled, Blackthorn would eliminate anyone who could connect him to the crimes, and that would include the children he'd used as unwitting spies. "We have to find her," Mary said suddenly. "We have to find Sarah and the other children before Blackthorn realizes his entire operation is compromised." "Mrs. Whitehorse," Crawford said gently, "that girl has probably been running since the night she left your ranch. She could be anywhere between here and Canada by now. And even if we could find her, she's just one child among many who are in danger." "She's not just one child," Mary replied, her voice carrying a strength that surprised even her. "She's our daughter. And daughters don't abandon their families when things get dangerous." Ezra looked at his wife with new understanding. Despite the betrayal, despite the lies and deception, Mary had made her choice. The girl who'd sat at their kitchen table learning to make pie crust was still their daughter, regardless of who had sent her to them or why. "There's something else in the evidence," Ezra said, pulling out one of Sarah's carefully copied documents. "Blackthorn's been using a network of safe houses and way stations throughout the territory, places where his people can rest and resupply during operations. If Sarah's trying to warn the other families, she'd need to use those same routes." Crawford studied the map Sarah had drawn, marking locations with the precision of someone who'd traveled those paths many times. "She's moving in a pattern," he realized. "Not running randomly, but following a specific route that connects to the families that are in immediate danger." "She's trying to warn them all," Mary said. "Even knowing that it puts her in mortal danger, she's trying to save every family her father has marked for destruction." The federal marshal looked at the evidence again, seeing it now not just as documentation of crimes, but as a roadmap to salvation. If they could follow Sarah's path, they might be able to reach the targeted families before Blackthorn's hired killers did. It was dangerous, probably suicidal, and would require them to outmaneuver a network of criminals who knew the territory better than any federal agents. "I can't officially sanction this kind of operation," Crawford said carefully. "But I can't stop private citizens from traveling where they choose, and I can't prevent them from warning their neighbors about potential dangers." It was as close to official approval as they were going to get. Within hours, they were back on the trail, following the route Sarah had mapped out, racing against time and a madman's methodical revenge to save families who didn't even know they needed saving. But as they rode deeper into the Wyoming wilderness, both Ezra and Mary carried the terrible knowledge that they weren't just trying to save strangers. They were trying to save the daughter who'd betrayed them, lied to them, and despite everything, had somehow managed to win their hearts completely. The question that haunted them both was whether they would find her in time, or whether Blackthorn's final revenge would claim the one person who'd shown them what it meant to be parents. The abandoned mining camp where they found Sarah looked like a monument to broken dreams, its weathered buildings standing like tombstones against the Wyoming sky. She was huddled in what had once been the assayer's office, her body racked with fever and her clothes torn from days of desperate travel through hostile territory. When Mary knelt beside her, Sarah's eyes opened with the wild look of someone who'd been running on fear and determination long past the point of exhaustion. "Mrs. Whitehorse?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper, cracked from dehydration and raw with emotion. "You shouldn't be here. It's not safe." "Hush now," Mary said, pulling Sarah into her arms with the fierce protectiveness of a mother bear. "We're taking you home." "There is no home," Sarah replied, tears streaming down her dirt-stained face. "Not for me, not after what I've done. And there won't be homes for any of the families if we don't warn them." "The Hendersons, the McCormicks, the Pratts, they're all going to die because of me, because I helped my father plan their destruction." Ezra knelt on Sarah's other side, his weathered hands gentle as he checked her for injuries. She was running on pure willpower now, her body pushed far beyond its limits by the desperate need to undo the damage she'd helped create. But even in her weakened state, her eyes burned with a determination that reminded him powerfully of the girl who'd stood on that auction platform months ago, not defeated, but calculating her next move. "How many families have you warned?" he asked. "3," Sarah replied, struggling to sit up straighter. "The Hendersons got away, packed up, and headed east before the raiders could reach them. The McCormicks didn't believe me at first, thought I was trying to trick them somehow. But when I showed them the evidence I'd copied, they saw the truth. They're hiding in the caves up near Copper Creek." "And the third family?" Sarah's face crumpled with grief and exhaustion. "The Millers. I was too late. Found their ranch already burning when I got there. But I hope, some of them might have escaped. There were horse tracks leading away from the house, and I didn't see any bodies in the yard." Mary felt her heart breaking for this girl who'd been carrying such an impossible burden alone. Sarah had been traveling for days across dangerous territory, racing against her father's methodical murder schedule, trying to undo years of careful planning with nothing but her own courage and the evidence she'd risked everything to steal. "Sarah," Mary said gently, "we found your letter. We took the evidence to the federal marshals in Denver. There's going to be a full investigation." "It won't be fast enough," Sarah replied, her voice heavy with despair. "My father knows his operation is compromised now. He's accelerating everything, trying to eliminate all the witnesses before the federal authorities can act. The other children, the ones he placed with families like he placed me, they're all in danger now. He can't let any of us live to testify about what we've seen." Ezra felt a chill run down his spine. "How many other children are there?" "7 that I know of for certain. Maybe more. Most of them don't even know they're being used as spies. They think they're just earning their keep by telling their foster parents' business to a kind man who takes interest in their welfare." Sarah's laugh was bitter and broken. "Some of them actually love their adoptive families. They're going to die never understanding why." "Then we find them," Mary said firmly. "All of them. We get them to safety before your father can silence them." "You don't understand," Sarah protested. "He has men everywhere. Professional killers who make murder look like accidents or Indian raids. You can't fight that kind of organization with just the 3 of us." "We won't be alone," Ezra said, pulling out the telegram he'd received that morning from Marshal Crawford. "The federal task force is mobilizing faster than expected. They'll have agents in the territory within 2 days. But you're right that it might not be fast enough for the children who are in immediate danger." Sarah studied the telegram with the same calculating expression she'd worn while reviewing ranch accounts, her fevered mind still sharp enough to process tactical information. "There's a gathering," she said suddenly. "My father calls it a family reunion. All his placed children are supposed to report to the old Blackthorn estate tomorrow night for what he told them would be a celebration and reward for their service." It's a trap, Ezra realized. He's planning to eliminate all of them at once. 7 children between the ages of 12 and 16, Sarah confirmed. Plus me if I'm stupid enough to show up. He's probably planning to make it look like an accident, a fire maybe, or a building collapse. Something that would generate sympathy for the poor judge who lost so many of the orphans he'd tried to help. Mary felt sick at the calculated cruelty of it. Blackthorn wasn't just a criminal, he was a monster who could murder children while positioning himself as their benefactor. The kind of evil that wore a respectable face and used society's protective instincts to cover its crimes. "We have to stop it," she said. "Those children don't deserve to die for their father's sins or their foster parents' innocence." "How?" Sarah asked. "The estate is heavily guarded, and my father will be expecting trouble. He's not the kind of man who leaves anything to chance." Ezra was quiet for a long moment, thinking through possibilities and tactics with the strategic mind that had kept him alive through 4 years of war. "You said the children think they're going to a celebration?" "Yes. They've been told they're heroes who helped bring justice to families that wronged their benefactor during the war. Most of them believe they've been doing righteous work. Then they'll come willingly, without suspicion. They won't be prepared for violence because they think they're among friends." Ezra's voice was grim as he worked through the implications. "Which means they'll be easy targets unless someone warns them first." "Or unless someone gets there first," Mary added. "Sarah, you know these children. You know how they think, what they'll believe. Could you convince them that they're walking into a trap?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "Maybe, some of them anyway, but I'd have to be there myself, and my father will be watching for me specifically. He knows I'm the one who exposed his operation. He'll kill me the moment he sees me." "Not if he doesn't see you coming," Ezra said. "Sarah, you know that estate better than anyone. You know your father's security arrangements, his habits, his blind spots. If we're going to save those children, we need someone on the inside who can get to them before the trap closes. You're asking me to sacrifice myself for children I barely know." "No," Mary said firmly. "I'm asking you to trust us to keep you safe while you do what you've already been doing, protecting innocent families from a madman's revenge." Sarah looked between them. These people who had every reason to hate her, but who were instead offering to risk their lives to help her save strangers. The betrayal she'd committed against them seemed almost insignificant compared to the trust they were showing her now. "There's something else," she said quietly. "Something I didn't put in the letter because I wasn't sure if it was true. But I think my father might not be entirely sane anymore." "The way he talks about his son's death, the elaborate nature of his revenge schemes, it's like he's been consumed by his grief until there's nothing left but the need to make others suffer." "What do you mean?" Ezra asked. "He talks to Thomas sometimes, his dead son. I've heard him having conversations with empty rooms, arguing with ghosts, making plans that only make sense if you believe the dead are still giving you orders." Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper. "I think killing all those families wasn't enough for him anymore. I think he needs to destroy everyone and everything that reminds him that his son is gone and never coming back." The implications were terrifying. A grieving father seeking revenge was dangerous enough, but a man who'd lost touch with reality was unpredictable in ways that made him infinitely more deadly. There would be no reasoning with him, no appealing to his better nature, no hope that he might see the horror of what he'd done and choose to stop. "Then we end it tomorrow night," Ezra said. "We save those children and we make sure Judge Cornelius Blackthorn never hurts another family." As they prepared to leave the abandoned mining camp, Sarah pulled Mary aside. "Mrs. Whitehorse, I need you to know something. When I first came to your ranch, everything I told you about my feelings was a lie. But somewhere along the way, those lies became true. You showed me what it means to be loved unconditionally, and that's a gift I can never repay." "You don't need to repay it," Mary replied, brushing a strand of hair from Sarah's fevered face. "That's what love is. It's freely given, with no strings attached. And Sarah, you'll always be my daughter, no matter what happens tomorrow night." As they rode through the gathering darkness toward the Blackthorn estate, all three of them carried the knowledge that they were heading into almost certain death. But they also carried something more powerful than fear: the unbreakable bond of a family that had chosen each other despite lies, betrayal, and the worst kind of human evil. Tomorrow night would bring either salvation or destruction, but it would find them facing it together. The Blackthorn estate loomed against the starless Wyoming sky like a monument to corrupted ambition, its Gothic revival architecture twisted into something that seemed to mock the very notion of home and family. Built with money earned from territorial appointments and questionable land deals, the mansion squatted on a hill overlooking the valley like a vulture waiting to feast on the bones of the innocent. Sarah crouched behind a stand of aspen trees, watching the final preparations for her father's grotesque family reunion. 7 children had arrived throughout the afternoon, all of them bright-faced and eager, believing they were coming to receive recognition for their service to justice. The youngest was barely 12, a freckle-faced boy named Tommy who'd been placed with the Patterson family, the same family that had been massacred just days earlier. He had no idea that his foster parents were dead, killed by the same organization that had trained him to spy on them. The plan was simple in its evil efficiency. Judge Blackthorn had prepared a celebration dinner in the main dining hall, complete with a cake and speeches about the important work his young agents had performed. The children would eat, drink, and listen to his praise, never suspecting that their meal had been laced with enough strychnine to kill a horse. When their bodies were found the next morning, the story would be tragic but believable. A gas leak from the old furnace system had overcome the poor orphans during their sleep. The grieving judge would arrange beautiful funerals and establish a memorial fund, cementing his reputation as a man who dedicated his life to helping unfortunate children. "I can see the dining room from here," Sarah whispered to Ezra and Mary, who were positioned behind a low stone wall near the estate's kitchen garden. "They're all sitting at the big table and my father is giving some kind of speech. We don't have much time." Ezra checked his pocket watch by moonlight. "Marshal Crawford's men won't be in position for another hour. If we're going to do this, it has to be now." The plan they'd developed was desperate and relied heavily on Sarah's intimate knowledge of the estate's layout and her father's habits. She would enter through the servants' entrance using a key she'd stolen years ago, make her way to the dining room, and somehow convince 7 children to abandon their celebration and flee into the night with strangers. Meanwhile, Ezra and Mary would create a distraction that would draw away the guards and give the children a chance to escape. It was a plan with 1,000 ways to fail and very few paths to success. "Remember," Mary said, taking Sarah's face in her hands with the fierce tenderness of a mother sending her child into battle, "you don't have to save everyone tonight. Just warn them. Give them a chance to choose their own fate, instead of having it chosen for them." Sarah nodded, but her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "If something happens to me in there, I want you both to know that these past months with you have been the happiest of my life. You showed me what real parents look like, and I'll carry that with me no matter what comes next." "Nothing's going to happen to you," Ezra said firmly. "We're all going home together, and tomorrow morning you're going to help Mary make pancakes in our kitchen while I complain about how much syrup you both use." It was a beautiful lie, and they all knew it. but sometimes beautiful lies were what people needed to find the courage to do impossible things. Sarah slipped away into the darkness, moving with the silent grace of someone who'd learned to survive by being invisible. The servant's entrance was exactly where she'd left it years ago, and the key still turned smoothly in the well-oiled lock. The hallways of her childhood home felt like passages through a nightmare. Every familiar painting and piece of furniture now seemed to mock the innocence she'd lost within these walls. She could hear her father's voice before she reached the dining room, that same cultured tone he used in court when pronouncing sentences that would destroy lives. But tonight there was something different in his speech pattern, something that confirmed her worst suspicions about his mental state. "You've all served justice so beautifully," Judge Blackthorne was saying to the assembled children. "Thomas is so proud of what you've accomplished in his name. He speaks of you often, you know. He tells me how grateful he is that his death wasn't in vain." Sarah pressed herself against the hallway wall, horror crawling up her spine like ice water. Her father was talking about his dead son as if Thomas were present in the room, as if he were participating in the conversation. The children looked confused but polite, probably assuming this was some kind of metaphorical speech about honor and memory. "Now then," Blackthorne continued, raising his wine glass in a toast, "let's drink to Thomas, to justice, and to the important work that will soon be completed. Drink deeply, my dear children. You've earned every drop." Sarah burst through the dining room doors like an avenging angel, her voice cutting through the civilized atmosphere like a knife through silk. "Don't drink that! It's poisoned! He's trying to kill you all!" The children froze with their glasses halfway to their lips, confusion and fear warring in their young faces. Judge Blackthorne stood slowly, his pale eyes fixing on Sarah with the kind of cold fury that belonged in nightmares. "Sarah, my dear," he said, his voice calm as still water, "how lovely that you could join us. Thomas has been asking about you specifically." "Thomas is dead, Father," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. "He's been dead for 16 years. You've been talking to ghosts and murdering innocent people in the name of someone who can't hear you." Several of the children had put down their glasses now, Tommy's young face crumpling as he began to understand the horrible truth. These weren't celebration drinks. They were death sentences disguised as rewards. "Thomas isn't dead," Blackthorne said, moving slowly around the table toward Sarah. "He's right here with us. He's been guiding every step of our righteous work." "Haven't you, my boy?" The judge looked toward an empty chair at the head of the table, nodding as if receiving invisible instructions. The sight was more terrifying than any amount of rage or violence. This was a man who'd been consumed by grief until nothing remained but madness, wearing the mask of justice. "Children," Sarah said urgently, never taking her eyes off her father, "you need to run. Right now. Get out of this house and don't look back." Now," Blackthorne said, pulling a revolver from his dinner jacket. "There's no need for anyone to leave before the celebration is finished. We've prepared such a lovely evening, and it would be terribly rude to waste all that effort." But the children were already moving, their survival instincts finally overriding their confusion and politeness. Tommy grabbed the hand of a girl beside him and bolted for the nearest window. Others followed, some heading for doors, others diving under the massive dining table for cover. The sound of breaking glass and overturning chairs filled the air as 7 young lives chose chaos over certain death. That's when Ezra and Mary's distraction began. The explosion that rocked the estate's carriage house sent flames shooting into the night sky and drew every guard on the property away from the main building. In the confusion that followed, most of the children managed to escape into the darkness, following Sarah's shouted instructions to run toward the trees and keep running until they found help. But Sarah herself was trapped in the dining room with a madman and a gun. "You've ruined everything," Blackthorne said, his calm facade finally cracking to reveal the rabid hatred underneath. Months of planning, years of careful preparation, all destroyed by an ungrateful child who couldn't understand the importance of justice. This isn't justice, Father. This is murder. You've killed innocent families, destroyed children's lives, all for revenge against ghosts. They weren't innocent, Blackthorne screamed, spittle flying from his lips. They all had to pay for what they did to Thomas. Every family that benefited from the war while my boy died in the mud had to understand what loss really means. Ezra Whitehorse didn't murder Thomas, Sarah said, backing slowly toward the window. He killed a Confederate soldier in battle. That's what war is. Young men dying for old men's causes. But you've turned that tragedy into something monstrous. The gunshot shattered the night air like thunder, but it wasn't Judge Blackthorne who fired. Ezra Whitehorse stood in the doorway, his smoking Colt in his steady hand, watching as the corrupt judge crumpled to the floor. The man who'd spent 16 years planning elaborate revenge had met his end in the simplest way possible, shot by the same person who'd haunted his dreams for decades. "It's over," Ezra said quietly, lowering his weapon. "All of it. The revenge, the killing, the children being used as weapons. It's finally over." Mary appeared behind him, her face streaked with soot from the explosion, but her eyes bright with relief. "Are you hurt?" she asked Sarah, crossing the room to embrace the girl who'd saved 7 lives at the cost of almost losing her own. "I'm fine," Sarah whispered, though she was shaking like a leaf in a hurricane. "The children, did they all get away?" "All of them," Ezra confirmed. "Marshal Crawford's men found them hiding in the woods. They're scared and confused, but they're alive, thanks to you." As federal agents swarmed the estate and began the process of documenting the evidence of Blackthorne's conspiracy, Sarah found herself standing in the ruins of her childhood home, looking down at the body of the man who'd shaped her into a weapon, and then tried to use her to destroy the only real family she'd ever known. "I should feel something," she said to Mary, who stood beside her holding her hand. "Sadness, relief, something, but I just feel empty." "That's normal," Mary replied gently. "Grief is complicated even when it's for someone who hurt you. He was your father, Sarah, even if he was a terrible one. It's all right to feel whatever you're feeling." 3 weeks later, Sarah stood in the kitchen of the Whitehorse Ranch, watching Mary teach 2 of the rescued children how to make proper biscuits. The federal investigation had cleared them all of any wrongdoing and had exposed the full scope of Blackthorne's network. 7 territorial officials had been arrested, 2 railroad executives faced federal charges, and the land fraud conspiracy had collapsed like a house of cards. The other children were being placed with families who'd volunteered to help them heal from their trauma. Some would thrive, others would struggle, but all of them would have the chance to write their own stories instead of being trapped in someone else's revenge fantasy. "Sarah," Ezra called from the parlor where he was reading the morning newspaper, "there's an article here about the investigation. Says the federal government is establishing new oversight procedures for territorial appointments. Your father's corruption was so extensive that it's forcing them to reform the entire system." Sarah smiled, feeling something she hadn't experienced since childhood, genuine pride in work well done. So some good came out of all of it after all. "More good than you know," Mary said, setting down her mixing bowl and looking at Sarah with the kind of maternal pride that could heal old wounds. 7 children are alive because of your courage. Dozens of families won't be murdered because you chose to do what was right instead of what was safe. That's a legacy worth having. As the afternoon sun streamed through their kitchen windows, painting everything in shades of gold and hope, Sarah Blackthorne, now Sarah Whitehorse by legal adoption, finally understood what family really meant. It wasn't about blood or birth or the circumstances that brought people together. It was about the choice to love someone completely, to forgive their mistakes, and to stand together against whatever darkness the world might send. She was home at last, and this time no one could take it away from her.